Before and during the Vietnamese War, the people felt that the government was not making a change in what was happening in the war. Americans were told that the US got involved in Vietnam to stop communism, also known as a containment theory. Because there was a lack of men joining the army, males over the age of 18 were being drafted. Unfortunately, most of them did not make it back. The government was not trying to get Americans out of Vietnam's civil war, even though we were losing. With the Democratic Convention coming to Chicago, citizens burst into protests against the candidates running in the convention and anti-Vietnam. Since protesters had a fear of the war, McCarthy of the Democratic Party gained supporters who protested the war and their anger for the other candidates. Citizens who were protesting the war wanted the government to make a change. Most of these organizations, such as SDS, wanted things to be done peacefully. After failed attempts by the Chicago police to stop the protesters, the National Guards appeared with firearms, tear gas, and batons. Then the police attacked, beating people and attaching bayonets to the end of their rifles. The protesters were being abused to the point where it made them lose hope in the Democrats' ability to hear their voices and make a change in foreign relations, such as the Vietnam War.
And we didn't hear about Vietnam while we were in school at all. But all of a sudden, we started seeing, people were getting drafted and then coming back dead. We had a lot of, I come from the west side of Chicago. I know a lot of people that had died. And what was this war for? The older generation, went to World War II. It was a little bit more, it was, there were really good and bad guys. I mean, it was really, easy to work out Nazis versus Americans and, the Allies. Whereas, Vietnam, it was a civil war that we got involved in. Yeah. And so Johnson was running again, in 1968, and Eugene McCarthy, who was a peace candidate, he was going to remove all the troops from Vietnam. He started, he put his hat in the ring, and all the primaries, up until that were happening, Eugene McCarthy was beating Johnson. Mm-hmm. And so Johnson actually decided to pull out. He had a press conference, a news conference, where he said he was not going to run. So his vice president, which was Hubert Humphrey, was going to run. So he ran, and I just told you a lot of the states had just guys in the back rooms, smoking their cigars, and and Humphrey was going to be their candidate. So that's how it kind of was coming to a head. Also then, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother, decided to put his hat in the ring too. So you had two peace candidates against Humphrey. Unfortunately, like I said, we had there was a lot of upheaval in '68. He was shot and killed right after he won the California primary. We also had people like Martin Luther King came out against the war, but he was shot and killed in April. So it was like we had a lot of people, a lot of stuff was going on, and worldwide too. There was a lot of stuff going on worldwide. There was a lot of student revolutions and movements around the world at the same time.
Because Americans felt they didn't have an opinion on what happened in Vietnam, many of them joined organizations such as SDS, which were created in order to raise awareness and give a voice to the people being drafted into the war.
What was interesting about Thursday, and I don't know if you've, Dick Gregory, he's still alive, he's got a website and everything else. He spoke to the crowd, and we were going to, and we actually did, we're going to march past the amphitheater where the convention was, and we were going to go to his house to have coffee. We knew it was, we knew it was going to happen, kind of thing. The first time we did that in the afternoon, we got stopped by a tank and Jeeps with barbed wire on them. And made it, okay, we'll turn around. We went back to Grant Park. But then they closed off Grant Park. We couldn't go out either. We were all boxed in. So we went again, marched toward, we were given permission to march to 18th in Michigan. And there was just like a standoff for a little bit.
In a film produced by Urban Crisis, Dick Gregory, in response to a police officer, said, "We're not on our way of a convention. We are private citizens on our way to my house." Gregory is saying that we're all going to my house, which shows that all the protesters are part of a community, and if that community rises and lets their voices be heard, change can be made.
This Mr. Gregory were talking.
Hmm.
What'd you guys like talk about?
We're talking about the war in Vietnam. We're talking about civil rights. We're talking about, because he was very good friends with Martin Luther King. What was he like? He was a rather influential black comedian who was also involved in civil rights as well as anti-war rights. The anti-war movement.
The people felt that the government wasn't doing anything to help them, so they took matters into their own hands by creating an organization to make the Democrats hear their voice and show their support for McCarthy. Young people tried to show that they had a voice in politics due to the draft recruiting teens and young adults. Most young adults felt they wanted completely different things than their parents. The battle between the World War II generation and their baby boom kids showed a transition in patriotism and the shift to individualism.
There was a lot of animosity toward protests, and certainly animosity toward black protests. My parents called me an N lover, because I believed in integration and schools needed to be integrated and stuff like that. My mother was out there when African Americans got bused to the elementary school that my sisters were going, and she was out there throwing tomatoes at them when they were coming off the bus. That was that was the general attitude of that age group. Not all. It's like everything else. There was certainly a lot of our generation who did enlist in Vietnam and did believe in it, too. I mean, that's not to say that we were the only thing out there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was out there. He was one of the pressmen. I don't, you wouldn't know, that was a long time ago, but he worked in the Tribune Tower, and, the pressmen would be done, underneath, and they would come up and they would, harass long hairs, or anybody that looks. He actually one time said to me, I was stunned when he said this to me. He said, well, he says, yeah, me and a couple of my friends, we hit this one hippie girl so hard that we think she won't ever have kids. And I thought, it could have been me, Dad. That's what you're talking about. Because she was wearing a peace button. So, yeah. Violence, there was really polarization, here in Chicago in particular.
Rioters were losing hope in their government when they felt they were not being heard when they were facing violent encounters with police because there was a lack of support from Mayor Daley and the police force.
For the Democratic Convention, were you there because of anti-Vietnam, or were you there for what Mayor Daley did with the police for enforcement after Martin Luther King's death?
Both, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, because if you saw what it was like after what happened, it was horrible. I mean, really, his shoot to kill order.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first off, he said shoot to maim, and shoot to kill. We had a curfew actually in Chicago, like they did in Ferguson. We couldn't be on the street, anybody under the age of 21 at after 9 o'clock at night.
Wow.
I went to a dance, mixer we called them, around Fullerton and Holman area. I think it's Kimball, and the smoke from Madison Avenue was there. It was that strong. I mean, that's pretty far away. You're talking, it's a good 3 miles away.
After recent chaos broke out in Chicago streets because of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Mayor Daley ordered new police reinforcements. In a speech Mayor Daley gives after the riots during the Democratic Convention, he said, The confrontation was not caused by the police, but by the people who charged the police. Even though the protests were peaceful, the mayor decided to put the blame on protesters and allowed police brutality during the riot. The lack of fairness during these riots made many people lose faith in the government and the Democratic Party.
So, how did you react after Mayor Daley, he said shoot to kill, and then later on he said no, that's not what I meant.
Yeah.
They said it wrong. Like how did you feel about that? Like did that like anger you? Like,
I would just say it was because he made so many stupid mistakes. It was just like, okay, he's done it again. Another gap from, we actually had I have it at home, there was a book that came out, you know, the various quotes from Mayor Daley. I mean, he made so many gaffes.
yeah.
It was just like, yeah, it was, but it was typical him. The sad thing about that is that, you know, after the 68 convention, you know, there was a poll taken, you know, and everyone else in the country basically condemned what happened here, you know. People in Chicago, 95% supported Daley.
Really?
Yeah. So you were dealing with a very hostile climate if you were, you know, for any protest. And still live in Chicago.
Yeah.
I actually had, later on, a couple of years later, I was working in a restaurant, and a detective at this one police station that was very close to where I was living, he apologized to me. He says, "I'm so sorry because you were targeted to be harassed," which was nice for him to do. I mean, really was. He didn't do anything about it, but it was nice for him at least to apologize.
Rioters abandoned hope with the government because protesters were locked up in prison, harassed, and later put on the Red Squad list if they were seen as a threat.
Every time there was getting gatherings of SDS, there were more FBI agents and police agents than there were actually people that were actually members. You know, because everybody was being spying on everybody else. I mean, the Chicago Police Department had a thing called the Red Squad. I had a file. I had a Red Squad file. I had an FBI file. They knew where I lived. They knew everything. My phone was tapped. They knew everything. So, and I wasn't going to make a secret out of it. I mean, that's who I was. So yeah, I was a target, but their kind of things was intimidation, not confrontation so much as intimidation.
The Online Encyclopedia of Chicago showed that a majority of the protesters that were arrested were placed on the Red Squad list. After many protesters were arrested, some felt they were being illegally searched. When protesters didn't cooperate with the police, they automatically accused them of being a communist and fighting against the government. Since the police had this pre-notion that the protesters were communist, the protesters faced horrible harassment from the police officers.
I should do a little coda about being arrested because they assigned you a cop. No person actually physically said you're arrested. You know, they assigned you a police officer. They also strip searched us, and I was strip searched twice. Another lady who was very mouthy, she was strip searched 7 times. You know, which is very illegal. And 11 years later, you know, I'm sitting there watching Dan Rather on the news, you know, with the person who would become my husband, watching the news, and I'm watching the video. I'm like, that's me being arrested. You know, I was actually seeing the tape of me being thrown in a paddy wagon. I'm like, okay, I got to hear this story. And the ACLU took it to court about those you know, strip searches and said it was illegal, it was unconstitutional. You know, so, you know, I felt good that I was actually part of something that was made unconstitutional.
As the election of 1968 came to an end, the American people struggled to make their voices heard in the Democratic Party about the Vietnam War. Since there was a clash of different generations' beliefs, violence broke out between cops and the protesters. The riots took place during the Democratic Convention, which caused many Americans to lose hope in the Democrats' ability to make a change in not drafting in the Vietnam War.